Hi, y'all. I miss having you guys in class on Friday. I miss seeing you all, and I wanted to to just talk a little bit about the Victorian era because we're really going to delve into it when we go back on Wednesday. So the Victorian era lasts a really long time, 1830 to 1901. That's partly because Queen Victoria lived a very, very long time. Queen Elizabeth just passed away, but before that, before very recently, she had been the longest reigning monarch, 80 some odd years that she sat on the throne. And during this time, obviously, a lot of things changed. I mean, in the 1830s, we're kind of still at the end of the Romantic era in a lot of ways. But we're going to have huge advances in science, right, with Charles Darwin, 1856, Origin of the Species, right, changes people's thoughts about, where we came from, how we got here. It really creates a lot of uncertainty about religious beliefs, right? So we have that. We have a lot of industrialization, obviously. The first thing we're going to talk about is the railway and what a huge difference that made in England in terms of just communication and also obviously things like pollution, right? Speaking of that, factory life is getting more and more intense, and we'll be reading about that in Mary Barton. Social changes are afoot as more and more people clamor for the right to be represented and the right to vote. So the Peterloo massacre sort of foreshadows a lot of things that are to come, including the Chartists. Women's roles are really changing, right? As women are starting to really question a lot of conventional standards of femininity. And what have I forgot? Oh, yes, the British Empire. It keeps on growing and growing, although it is soon to wane, right? So that's a lot. And one of my favorite, I wanted to show you a clip, if this works, from one of my favorite shows. This is called Victoria. It's a PBS.
The messenger from Windsor is here. The king is dead.
Your Majesty, I'm afraid.
And it starts when she's 16 and she takes the throne, right?
This is not a game.
It shows some of the violence that's going on at this time. I mean,
The
it's
greatest nation on earth. Surely you understand what is at stake here.
Great responsibility lies before me, and I assure you, I am ready.
It's a bit of a soap opera, but it is an interesting show to watch if you guys like these kinds of things, because it really does give you a sense of a lot of the changes that are going on and a lot of the sort of decisions that Queen Victoria, or rather Parliament, right, had to make. So,
The messenger from Windsor is here.
we're not going to listen to it again. Sorry. Okay, so this is Rocket. Rocket was the first locomotive in 1830. Ironically, the very beginning of the Victorian era. This is when the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opened. And this is huge, right? Because now, like I said, people can get from place to place. Steam power really allows for a lot of new inventions, a lot of new progress, and also, like I said, a lot of pollution. But rocket, this is a huge thing, and traveling on the railways is something that a lot of people talk about and write about in the Victorian era. So you'll see it in a lot of novels if you end up reading sort of longer Victorian novels. Like I said, there's a lot of class tension, mostly, again, around the right to vote. And there's a lot of tension about, the poor, how the poor are taken care of. So in 1832, there's this huge reform bill, the Reform Bill of 1832, and it's supposed to sort of help a lot of these things. And so it extended the right to vote to lower middle class men, but not women, of course. And it abolished this electoral system where people who had a lot of land, like think Jane Austen, all the people, it's so important to have your land. If you have land, then you have power, then you can vote. Before this, you really needed to have land in order to vote. And as things get more and more industrial, it becomes more and more important to detach land from power, right? Also, I would say that the Poor Law really changed the way that people who were impoverished were taken care of, but, not always for the better. They really increased the working house, which was this sort of idea that if you were poor, you could be taken care of, but you had to work for it, right? So the workhouse becomes a real trope, and you'll see it in things like Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, which, even though we won't be reading it, hopefully you've heard of it, and sort of the way that this orphan boy is mistreated in a poorhouse. And also, in terms of medicine, now they tried to make it better so that they couldn't be like robbing graves in order to do dissections, but now it was just the bodies of the criminals, and also the what's the word I'm looking for, the unclaimed. So yeah, just in medical terms, that is a really interesting twist. And again, it increases the stratification of society, where prostitutes, criminals, they're all considered like people that can be done away with, that can be experimented on. That will definitely come up when we read about the Jack the Ripper murders. Yeah. So 1840s, as opposed to the 1830s, are a real time of troubles. There is severe depression. There is a widespread unemployment. There's a lot of workers who live in very, very unsanitary housing. I mean, it was bad before, right? We've talked about that. But now people are living closer and closer to each other. The factories are getting bigger. People are getting more and more overcrowded, right? So you have works of art like Ford Madox Brown's work, where you see sort of, if I were in class, I would ask you to tell me what you observed here, but they were very sort of realist types of depictions, where you would see sort of the babies, right, who are, brought to work with people. So you can see the baby right there. You can see the woman who is, working really hard in the factory. You can see this person who looks like he might be a person who is blind. And you can see them all sort of working hard, while you see this sort of view from the outside, which is not their world, right? Not the world in which they live. So, all right. So like I was talking about, the Chartists are, so there's a lot of tension around a lot of these issues, the ones that are exemplified in Ford Madox Brown's in work, right, that we just saw. And so the Chartists are really radical at the time group, but they really believe in social values. They really believe in equality for men. I have a friend doing some really cool work about the Chartists and the way that women and, people who are otherwise othered are really not looked upon very highly. But anyway, that's a tangent. So they draw up a charter advocating the right of all people, meaning men, right, to vote. And they also want to abolish high taxes. They really want sort of more social equity, and they're really influenced by Marx and Engels, who we will read also for Wednesday a little bit, right? And so this is a talk at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival that really kind of considers the Chartists and just how radical they were.
So we're arriving now, unfortunately, to the industrial era. This is, UK was the first area of the world to industrialise, London the first city of over 1 million people, and with industrialism you had the first ever industrial working class and the first ever arrival of the consciousness of the people. And you had mass movements like this is a Chartist movement. I won't go into tell you about who the Chartists were, but they gave us many of the rights, privileges and freedoms that we enjoy as a modern democracy. They were a grassroots workers' struggle. They'd have mass rallies like this. Poetry was right at the centre. They'd have a DIY pamphlet, Ecology of Press, where they were all writing poems, even people who were only semi-literate literate. That was their part. That was their way to take part in the conversation, to take part in the political and the cultural conversation of their day, and they were learning about each other through this. You'd also have orators getting up, unamplified, early Victorian Britain, huge stages in front of many hundreds of people and rocking it in front of crowds, including people like this. This is Ernest Jones, one of the most famous poets of the movement. No, no, we cry united by our suffering's mighty length. Ye have ruled for ages, now we shall rule as well. You can almost hear this on a stage, right? This is it's rhythmic, it's got exclamation marks, it talks from a perspective of a collective we, it's unapologetically persuasive, rhetorical, right? And any spoken word rap fans will recognise this stuff. Ernest Jones, when he died, had 10,000 people at his funeral in Manchester, right? So any poets in the room, that's we've got some standards to be putting in. So we are standing on the shoulders of giants. Now, mostly we've been looking in this talk at the radical history of spoken word. I want to take a little digression because during my research I came across, this is not research I've done, but research that other people have done on Charles Dickens. Put your hand up if you like Charles Dickens. Yeah, many people don't know about Charles Dickens. He was one of the UK's most famous ever practitioners of live literature. He was a consummate performer, a legendary performer. People were known to swoon at his performances, pack into huge auditoriums. He was a great celebrity in the United States, where he toured extensively, and people would pack in for many hours at a time to hear him speak, even without ventilation. This is his last gig in London. People stay for 3 hours. Look at the dresses they're wearing. 3 hours. There's no aircon, right, in this period, and only a few people left during that show. Touring hastened his demise, actually. He got into debt and was touring too much. So any poets who've been lugging themselves around on megabus, then Charles Dickens knows your shit. And
all right, so, yep, those are the Chartists, right? And then from there, again, and these things are not like self-explanatory. What was I going to say? They, like these time periods, I mean, a lot of people are still, there's still a lot of foment, right? And so when I say a time of prosperity, I mean like a lot of people have prosperity, but that does not mean everybody, right? And so the rich get richer and the poor, get poorer, as always. And so this is a stately staircase winds around a large hall in the Victorian era. I'm sure you've seen illustrations like this before. If you've seen the movie Titanic, you see scenes very familiar to this, right? Of the people on board the ship Titanic before it sank. So there is a lot of prosperity, and to show off this prosperity, England makes the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, right? And this is sort of an exhibition to show off all the science and technology and all the great things that the British Empire has done. And so the whole thing is covered in glass, which is like a huge thing. It takes a lot of time and work to cover the whole thing in glass. There's trees growing inside, as you guys can see. And they show off a lot of the, it's sort of like a huge World's Fair almost, right? 1851, they show off a lot of the things that England has come up with, including the first flushable toilet. And as you guys can imagine, that's huge. But yeah, so they are really, really proud of themselves and what they have done. And meanwhile, a lot of people are still, struggling. And remember that when you read Mary Barton, it takes place only a few years later than this exhibition. So you have to sort of juxtapose those two things, okay? So there's a lot of sort of conflicts going on. Probably one of the biggest ones is the one between religion and science. So there's a whole group called the utilitarianists. We still have this in philosophy. If any of you study philosophy, the idea of the greatest happiness for the greatest good. Creeds were only good if they were useful, if they made you happy, and if they made the greatest number of people happy. In opposition, people like John Henry Newman believed that only more conservative religion could fight this sort of wave of craziness flooding the nation, right? So he led a movement for Anglo-Catholicism. He later becomes Catholic himself. He wants to sort of return, he wants to sort of, make England great again and return to sort of conservative values. I'm just being flippant. Don't mind me. Astronomy and geology also made really huge advances. So people now are aware of, different planets. It was very hard for people to decide what to believe. And like I said, in 1859, you have Charles Darwin, who writes The Origin of the Species. This obviously made a huge impact, although for a while it was really considered ludicrous. So you have funny cartoons like this one depicting Darwin as an ape in 1871, which is quite a bit after he published his tract. So it's not like people read it and were like, oh yeah, that's totally what happened, right? People did not feel that way, and there was a lot of confusion about that. So mental vigor, I think, and moral courage which it contained. That so few want to be eccentric marks the chief danger of the era, right? So for him, if people aren't eccentric, if people aren't different, if people don't try to be outside of whatever their social role is, then we as a society are just not going to progress, is what John Stuart Mill believes, right? So he writes that the only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, as long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs, or impede their efforts to obtain it. Each is the proper guardian of his own health, whether bodily or mental or spiritual. Mankind are greater gainers by suffering each other to live as seems good to themselves than compelling each to live as seems good to the rest. So everybody just do what's good for you, and don't try to make other people live in your way, like in the way that you choose to live, right? Which sounds good. It also might sound familiar to you, since Mill's ideas are considered the beginnings of libertarianism. And this is from David Boaz's Libertarianism, a Primer. Libertarianism is the view that each person has the right to live his life in any way he chooses. I mean, it sounds a lot like what Mill just wrote, right? So the only actions that should be forbidden by law are those that involve the force against those who have not themselves. I hate this little thing because I can't read off of it. But in any case, the idea is that you don't hurt others, you don't rape, you don't rob, you don't kidnap, you don't kill. But other than that, like, government should kind of stay out of it. And, so a lot of these ideas that we wrestle with today are ideas that were definitely being wrestled with in the Victorian era, as people are trying to figure out what is the best way for people to be governed, what is the best way for people to live. And these are just some, and so I think this idea of nonconformity and originality, I find it really fascinating, and I love to think about it, to think about sort of putting people into boxes, and to think about what originality might even mean. I like this because in some ways, or even originality, I would argue, has been kind of commodified today, right? If you type in individuality on Google, I mean, look at the things that you get, like individuality. You get things that are fashionable, right? But this is not the only person with this haircut, right? Or with those earrings. So is that individualistic, or are you just conforming to a different standard? This too was entitled Individuality. Don't ask me why. I have no idea. And all of these. Yeah, I especially don't understand the young guy drinking in his dorm room, because that is sort of the opposite of individuality. But anyway, so the question of how we maintain ourselves, right? Our identity, our personhood in a society that's increasingly commodified, that's increasingly industrialized, that's increasingly bent on putting us into certain pegs, is a really huge one in the Victorian era. So I just wanted to end with this. When people are free to do as they please, they usually imitate one another. I just thought that was kind of funny, and maybe a good way to wrap up this little prelude to the Victorian era. I look forward to delving into it with Marx and Engels and Gaskell's Mary Barton, which I wish we could read the whole thing. It's a really great book. But I will see you all on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of your fall break.